Hello and welcome to the second in the series of conversations we are conducting with some of the key experts on countries whose policies are of great consequence to displaced Syrians. We are today speaking to Dr. Bente Scheller, who is the director of the Heinrich Boell Foundation in Beirut since 2012. Dr. Scheller is one of the knowledgeable people when it comes to issues of concern to displaced Syrians. She has written extensively on the subject, and also she has in fact served from 2002 to 2004 at the German embassy in Damascus. She also led the Berlin Aspen Institute Syria's program. And as I said, she has written extensively on the aspects of the possible political process and issues that, as I said, are of great consequences to displaced Syrians. In addition, the topic of today's conversation, Germany and displaced Syrians, is, of course, something that is of great concern to more than 1 million Syrian refugees who live in Germany today. And this is one of the issues that we will cover in today's conversation. But also, very importantly, Germany is probably at the heart of various EU policies that affect displaced Syrians, and we will try to illuminate some of these in the conversation. Dr. Scheller, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us today.
Thank you very much for having me here. Actually, if I may correct, I'm not head of the Beirut office. I was so until 2 years ago, but now I'm head of the Middle East department of the Heinrich Boell Foundation in Berlin.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that correction. And we will send our friends at the Beirut office a message to update your biography on the website. The first issue that I want to discuss with you comes, in fact, from the email exchange we had before this conversation. And you sent me a link to the news piece which speaks about the first Syrian refugee to run for political office in Germany, which is quite an uplifting story. Does this in any way speak to the degree of the integration of Syrian refugees in Germany? And how would you describe the process and the current point in time when it comes to the place that Syrians in Germany occupy and the degree to which they have achieved integration in the society?
Well, I think that this man is running for parliament is really such an achievement. I'm really very impressed. And his story is one of many where you can see people who found refuge here over the past years, over the 10 years of war in Syria, have really been working hard to achieve something here. We have a number of people who in less prominent functions got really, really well integrated because of all that they invested in it. Also because many had a chance to be kind of welcomed here. I mean, we see obviously all the right-wing extremists, populists, and other people who protest against refugees in Europe these days. But I think the Syrians who came here in 2014, 15 mainly met with a culture of welcome that was also unheard of. So I would say they were the first generation of people to flee to Germany who really met civilians, who met with citizens, who were partly hosted by citizens. And I think that really helped to find their way through Germany because we have a very complex bureaucracy. And it is, of course, not easy to really reach here and integrate. And I think for many, this was one key achievement and one key element. And therefore, I think we have many cases of people who can be very proud what they made out of reaching here.
Can you tell me today in Germany, how do people, how do Germans look back at the call, the invitation of the Chancellor Merkel to Syrians, which in the end led to such a big number of people settling, at least temporarily, in Germany? We know that right-wing populists in Germany and elsewhere attacked this decision in the context of the conversation that we know exists, great replacement theory and all that. But today, in view of what you just said, how do people look back on this?
It depends very much on how liberal they are, how progressive they are. There are many people who are not right-wing extremists, but they are very critical of that step. And I think Chancellor Merkel really has been criticized by many people in the political field for this decision. But in hindsight, I think back then she had quite a lot of support for it. And I think it is often also forgotten that it was in agreement, and it was, based on a decision with Hungary, basically, that Germany opened its borders. And this has been forgotten over the time, and this is largely due to giving too much space to right-wing extremists, I would say, because they are so loud and so vocal and so aggressive that many people don't dare to speak up to them and say, look, it's not really happening what you're saying. There is nothing like that. I mean, for example, the German economy thrived after the arrival of refugees here. It is really something that might not be connected at all, but it was very clear that the impact is not negative on the German economy. Germany benefits. I mean, it's a shrinking population. We have a less and less workforce, and therefore I think in some circles there always has been the discussion Germany needs to open up and welcome more people here. And I think the huge number of refugees that then came and the developments in German economy proved many of the counter arguments wrong. And as I mentioned, there are many success stories, individual success stories of refugees who also tell a different story. These people did not only want to come here to get privileges. No, they made something out of what they found here. They worked hard and they succeed in schools, they succeed in universities, they establish businesses here. So I think that is the best that we can see. And I think it is not given that much attention, because as soon as there is an incident with somebody with a refugee background, like a criminal incident or violence, this immediately takes the headlines and it is taken as an example to justify a more restrictive policy, whereas all these success stories hardly make it into policy making. Even those who are more in favor are possibly not really in favor of speaking out too loud, because they know it might cost them votes.
Precisely. As a Bosnian, I can very much identify with this in terms of the contribution that refugees often make to the societies, both through their eagerness to actually integrate and to build a new life, which inevitably comes with positive economic consequences. But also as a Bosnian, I want to ask you, I know that Germany was one of the most generous countries when it came to Bosnian refugees in the war, and it had quite a kind of structured program of resettlement once the Dayton Agreement was signed. How do you see the prospects for Syrian refugees in Germany in the coming years?
Well, I think for Syrian refugees, there is no real chance to return as long as Assad is there. This is the main reason for most to having left Syria, and therefore, as long as the regime in Syria doesn't change, how can they go back? I mean, we've seen some cases in which people returned on a voluntary basis or because of factors that were out of their control. And we have lots of stories which make clear it is not safe for anybody to return to Syria, because the regime does not know any mercy. There are no amnesties, there is no justice, there is nothing that would assure people that it's safe to go back. So I think we cannot really talk about a progress or a perspective to resettle soon. But I think for European states, and particularly for states like Germany that are doing so well, why would we focus so much on return? Of course, it is desirable if people want to return that they can do so. So we should definitely work on easing conditions and making sure that the factors that drove them out of their country get eliminated. But I think the example of Bosnian refugees is one in which we can say we should not have focused that much on return, because I remember that there was a lot of reporting when they came, but then they kind of vanished in society. I don't think that it was a major problem for Germany to have them here. So all the stories about resettlement, I would be very careful terming it like that, because there were many children born here who had never lived in Bosnia and they were resettled. And this was not a very good move for them personally, for their families. It was traumatizing. You probably know all that much better. So I think integration should be the focus, and seeing what can we do with people here who found refuge here. Why should we be so adamant on pushing them back? Why shouldn't we look into ways of keeping them here if they themselves want to stay here?
Precisely. When I said well-structured, I was trying to be diplomatic in the sense that there was a very clear cutoff point after which people were either resettled, or there was a kind of a second wave of displacement of Bosnians from Germany to the United States, primarily, who accepted them because it was too early. The conditions on the ground did not exist. But this is a conversation about Syria, and I will stick to the Syrian context, and the absence of safe environment in Syria is something that I will ask you about a bit later on. But your previous answer leads me to the next question, and that is that recently there was a decision by the German Ministry of Interior to stop or let the policy of non-deportation or non-refoulement expire in the cases of people who have committed some criminal deeds or in the eyes of the Ministry of Interior need to be deported back to Syria. The question that was very problematic for displaced Syrians there was that there was a kind of an explanation that certain areas in Syria were safe for these people to return. I mean, not explicitly, but there was an implicit assessment, which was in contradiction with what you just said and the previous decisions and very explicit positions of the German government that it is not safe for Syrians to return. Then we saw some regional governments kind of issue different interpretations of that. So can you illuminate for us what the status here is, and how could anyone come to a determination that it is safe for people, regardless of their background, if you want, to return to certain parts of Syria, especially because there is also a very problematic similar decision by the Danish immigration authorities that Damascus and Damascus countryside are somehow safe for people to return.
Exactly. The Danish authorities were first in deciding this. And I think it is a different degree still in Germany, because it is a discrepancy between what the foreign ministry says and what the ministers of interior decided. The foreign ministry, in a report that is not public, but it has been quoted all along, has been stating Syria is not safe, and they have a very detailed view of what is happening in the different regions of Syria. And I think they argue from what they see and what they learn from people on the ground, whereas the ministers of interior, I mean, Germany has several ones because of being federal, and therefore they just argued on the base of what is desirable for them in internal politics. And of course, they are also looking at the upcoming elections. And since the issue of hosting refugees here has been so politicized, and since everybody tries to win votes, basically arguing we'll protect the German people from something, and here the decision was based on, well, we have some people who come from a refugee background and they committed criminal offenses, or they are part of Islamist organizations, etc. This was what they took to argue that they should get rid of these these people. This is pretty much also how they formulated it. And they said, well, it is only for these people that we will consider deportations. But the message is really, really strong. I mean, learning from the foreign ministry that it's not safe anywhere in Syria, knowing that Syria is a state in which torture is common and tens of thousands have died under torture in the past years alone, how can you send anybody back? I mean, that means a criminal offender doesn't have human rights any longer. I mean, that would absolutely be against the German constitution. It would also be against any understanding of human rights to say for what kind of offenses people committed here, they lose basically all rights, including human rights. And therefore, I find it a highly problematic decision. And then also, when they were asked which areas they were talking about, we had a bit of the same as we saw previously when it was decided that in Afghanistan there are safe places. It's also a country in which you don't really find safety, and the Minister of Interior would not respond to where these areas exactly would be. With Syria, they argued, well, Damascus, because there is no fighting, and they also considered Kurdish areas. And I mean, Damascus, I just mentioned the regime and its approach to human rights. Then also the Kurdish areas, I can't really see that. First of all, most people are not from there. Second, the Kurdish authorities have been left alone with all the Islamists that traveled from Germany or other European states there. I mean, in the end, if we talk about Islamists traveling from one place to the other, many more traveled from Germany to Syria than the other way around. And German authorities also admitted when they talk about deportations or criminals for which they might consider these, they are talking about less than 90 people. To take such a decision for such a tiny group of people, it has a huge political impact. It sends absolutely the wrong signal to many Syrians who are here, to which this decision is very unsettling, and it might just open the door for a much broader policy of considering deportations.
This is possibly the greatest concern, that this is a slippery slope that then leads to broadening of the categories, broadening of areas that are seen as safe. Is there a place for a voice of displaced Syrians in this debate in Germany? Is there a way for them to be heard on this in the German media or in the German public debate?
Well, I think reactions in the press were quite unanimous. I mean, you have some newspapers, of course, that would try and justify the decision, but I think the majority criticized it, especially on these grounds of the slippery slope that you just mentioned on human rights. And so I think it's not a lost case in terms of public opinion. And we also have some organizations here, some really well-organized Syrian organizations that have established themselves in a way that people are also listening to them. And I mean, Families for Freedom, for example, the initiative that is taking care and that is bringing together all those people who have members of their family forcibly disappeared, they are quite prominent here. And this is, of course, a concern that people can share, that they can relate to. So yes, I think Syrians have possibilities to be heard here, but it is very important to keep that debate up. Otherwise, populists will just continue to push and push and push, repeat the same arguments, and in the end, by this war of attrition of words, they might succeed in drowning out Syrian voices. And therefore, we, for example, really try to underline this point time and again, and to also invite people for discussions on this or do political lobbying on this.
I certainly hope that this interview will also contribute, and we will try to do our best to amplify it. But let me switch to another area of issues which I think are of great interest to displaced Syrians, and that is the Germany's role in the shaping of the EU policy when it comes to displaced Syrians and ultimately the political process. First of all, let me ask you about the EU quote-unquote cooperation with Turkey when it comes to displaced Syrians and Syrian refugees. We know that Turkey hosts the largest number of displaced Syrians, and we know that there is some sort of an agreement in place. We also know that this relationship is very turbulent, let's put it mildly, and we saw what only can be termed as militarization of the EU borders, especially on the Greek border with Turkey, and some awful scenes last year. How would you describe this relationship, and how would you see it going forward when it comes to the relations between the EU and Turkey on this very specific issue?
The whole policy of trying to keep refugees outside the European Union, I'm very, very critical of that. And these images from Greece, it's just impossible to watch. How people are physically being pushed back and violently being pushed back. It is devastating to see, and it's really something that does not relate to the European Union's values. So I'm really critical of that. And in comparison, the deal that Turkey and the EU have on refugees is a kind of milder version. But I mean, that is pretty much also what opened the door for this, because refugees have a right to come here. I mean, we have the right to seek asylum, but if you don't let people enter, they cannot fulfill this right. So that's highly problematic. And the deal is a version in which European security policy is outsourced to Turkey on the back of the refugees. It's maybe not something easy to solve, because at the same time, Turkey has already opened its border to a number of refugees. And in the future, given the future of Idlib, I can see that they will have to do that once more. So, of course, I can see how they would also want others to take refugees. I think that Europe should open its borders, but if it is not willing to do so, then it should support Turkey in enabling it to do so. Otherwise, people will be stuck in Syria, which is probably the worst of all options. So by entering this kind of deal first, I think it is about selling out human rights. But then how do you end this? It has basically given Turkey also a means to blackmail the European Union. And in consequence, I would say it has even allowed Putin to push the European Union with refugees. They know Russia knows it's a vulnerable point, and seeing how this deal came into life, I think for Putin it has been an excellent possibility to recognize that Idlib is a kind of switch where he can allow the Syrian regime to push further and thereby pressure Turkey, but also pressure the EU. So I think by the deal we opened political ways that we might reconsider and that we might not want to have opened.
Now, this is something that I want to go in more depth with you, definitely, in the next few minutes. But let me first ask you, how do you see Germany's role within the context of EU policy towards Syria? And I'm asking you this from one side to try and illuminate for us how strong is Germany's impact on what the EU decides, but also with a view of what has been described as the imminent succession of Chancellor Merkel by Armin Laschet, who, let's say, from the perspective of displaced Syrians, has exhibited some very problematic views on Syria, including a kind of normalization of the Syrian regime and buying into some debunked theories about certain things that have taken place and crimes that were committed. Will the German role within the EU change with his accession?
We don't yet know whether he'll really be chancellor, so that we'll need to see in the elections. However, you're completely right. He has expressed completely different positions, where Angela Merkel always was very calm and looked at it in a very pragmatic way. I think Armin Laschet has been speaking from the perspective that normally is represented by certain very Christian organizations. I mean, he comes from the Christian Democratic Union Party, so maybe that's a natural link. However, this perspective, as you mentioned, is quite special because basically it was a propaganda fed perspective, differentiating by Syrians based on their religion, saying these are the good ones and those are the bad ones, and speaking out on behalf of Assad, basically. He has toned down in recent years. That is mainly something that we heard maybe 6-7 years ago from him. So I hope not everything is lost. So he still can get more informed and with a more diverse and more fact-based background, maybe his policy will be different, but that remains to be seen, and it might be quite hard work. And of course, by his position, he's catering to a very specific audience. We should not forget that he is a politician, that elections are upcoming. So maybe it is, we don't know whether the things he says are based on a lack of knowledge or whether they are politically calculated.
Let me just kind of repeat my original question, but with an addition of this prospect. Yes, as you said, it is not a given that he will be the next chancellor. But like you mentioned before, Russia is one of the key factors in the Syrian quagmire. And for instance, recently it organized this conference that was deemed to be a farce by the majority of the West, but as you can imagine, displaced Syrians first and foremost, where the Syrian regime and Russia, who are the main source of displacement in Syria, are organizing a conference on return without any real change in the policy towards the Syrian people. The EU has stayed away. Do you think that there is a chance of such approach by the EU and Germany changing in the future?
Well, basically, Russia has worked hard on the European Union to try and establish this. I mean, the European Union has put itself behind the UN Resolution 2254, in which a transition is a precondition for basically everything else in Syria, including reconstruction. And it has been reaffirmed several times, if the human rights situation in Syria does not improve, there is no chance the European Union enters into discussions about reconstruction. Russia has been pushing for changing that equation and saying, well, let's offer refugee return to Syria in exchange for reconstruction money from the EU. And basically, we're lucky the regime has always undermined that. When Russia launched this for the first time, the Syrian regime came out with its law number 10 or the decree 66, the two decrees that are really making it very difficult for refugees to return because their properties will be confiscated, or it will be possible to confiscate them. So I think the regime has crossed Russian policies, but it doesn't mean that Russia is stopping. And the conference that you just mentioned, I think it was done on behalf of Russia because Russia pushed so hard. Russia knows that refugees and return are a topic of discussion in many European countries, and therefore I think it is trying to win those over to see whether certain countries of the EU would normalize if they could send some refugees back to Syria. However, those countries normally don't have a really large number of refugees. And one point that Germany, as well as Great Britain or France, the three states that in the former European policies were strongest in countering the normalization approach, they mostly made the point what to expect from the Syrian regime. What can they offer in return? We haven't seen them accomplishing anything that they ever promised. Whatever deal they made, they ruined it, they didn't stick to it. So they have been trying to tell other European states, there is nothing that you will win in such a deal, even if Russia or the regime offer return of refugees from your countries. This is nothing that you'll ever see. In exchange, however, you'll be asked to pay. Do you really want to enter a flawed deal like this? And I'm not sure whether for a future German government this will be so clear in the Foreign Office. I think many people understand it that way, but I mean, politicians are informed by a number of sources and driven by a number of interests, and therefore it would be really important to keep up this line, no normalization, if we see we cannot win anything in return and the human rights situation doesn't improve.
This is a key issue from the perspective of displaced Syrians, those that I know and speak to, and the organization that we are doing this interview for, the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity, are of the position that the minimum precondition for any conversation about return, about reconstruction, about elections, about anything else, is the establishment of a safe environment which would guarantee safe and dignified return. And one unprecedented thing about Syria is that there are 13 million displaced people. This is the majority of the population, which elevates the issue of the rights of the displaced people to a safe and dignified return to the top of the agenda if we really want to talk about a sustainable political solution. As you rightly described now, the regime is not only unwilling to make any concessions, in fact, it is kind of ramping up the discriminatory policies. Just last week, we saw the kind of implementation of the decision that refugees who have fled and who are not willing to return to serve in Assad's army have to pay $8,000 American as a compensation if they want to keep that property. These decisions are unsustainable. As we know in the Dayton Peace Accords, if you want a minimum of kind of solidity and credibility of the political solution, the property rights of the refugees and displaced people must be respected. And this is just one small element of what constitutes safe environment, not to mention the issue of the detainees and so on and so forth. We are actually speaking today when the UN Special Envoy is to address the Security Council on what is clearly a demise of the political process so far due to the intransigence of the regime. How do you see any meaningful political solution in Syria being possible under the current circumstances, both personally and also what do you think the German government sees it as possible in the current circumstances? One of the greatest fears is this kind of piecemeal approach where you accept the crumbs of, okay, just at least something has changed, even if it is cosmetic, when in fact the fate of these 13 million people is not being addressed at all.
Well, I think that is really the most important point that you just mentioned. And I mean, your association has been doing such important work to understand all these things, how citizens' rights are not only curbed, but they get trampled on every single day and every single day a bit further in Syria. So I really think that nobody will buy into the regime's cosmetic reforms that it might offer one day, because it is very important that the substance changes. But if we look at the core issue that would be necessary for return, that is, as you said, a minimum of stability and security, maybe. But for the regime, this is completely unacceptable. The regime lives on fear, and the regime has to do arbitrary decisions to keep citizens afraid, because over the past years, it has made this experience that whatever it used against citizens, it has been able to kill them, it has been able to displace them. Hundreds of thousands have died, and the majority of the population had to flee from their homes, and still people are going to the street whenever they can. Still people are protesting the regime, and therefore the regime is absolutely aware there is no security for itself any longer unless it continues its brutal, arbitrary persecution of citizens, and when no citizen can feel safe, this is what enables the regime to stay. We therefore have a complete opposite of what would be needed for return and what the regime can and does want to offer. Security is not in their cards, and we should always focus on that. When looking at what the regime is offering, if we can't have a release of detainees, information about the disappeared, a sincere confidence-building measure that would be, and whenever we see that nothing is improving, we can't really normalize. And this regime cannot change. It will not change, and it cannot change. And also we should understand whenever anything is given to the regime doesn't feel that it should give anything in return. The regime thinks it is entitled to have reconstruction money. It thinks it is entitled that people normalize with it, and it will always launch a next demand. It will never give anything in return. So I think it's absolutely impossible to have a future Syria where citizens can return and live in peace with this regime. I think really transition is the starting point for a discussion about a constructive future for all Syrians, and we are not yet there. And therefore, I hope that governments will be bright enough to see through whatever the regime would put up to make people believe it is changing. The regime doesn't change, and it can't change.
On that note, do you think that the new administration in the United States, the arrival of the new administration, albeit with some old names that we all remember from Obama's administration in it, will prove to be a decisive factor in the reformulation of the political process along the lines that you just described? Does this realization that you just laid out about the impossibility of a genuine, lasting, stable political solution with the regime in place as it is, does it exist in the corridors of power in Berlin or with the new American administration?
I think it exists in both. The question is just how strong is it in trying, how strongly will people believe in doing something to implement it, or will they rather get tired by the regime just continuing down its path? I mean, this is very successful for the regime. It just continues what it is doing. And after a while, people say, well, we can't really change it, so let's live with it. Let's open a new page. This is the most dangerous thing, that people get tired and fail to understand that nothing will come out of it. It's not a solution just to give in. On the contrary, it confirms injustice, and it continues to enable injustices, and it might even add new injustices to it. And if you get tired and lazy to try and understand that, you might enter policies that are not constructive at all. And I mean, you said there are some old names from the Obama administration. I think the Obama administration's policy on Syria was basically already a foundation for an approach that would in the long term go wrong. So I'm not sure how much hope we should pin on these people who have long been familiar with the Syria portfolio as well as with the entire Middle East. We should not put too much hope into them having a new idea, a new approach to it. Also because many of the possibilities they would have had don't exist any longer in that form. So they can work on parts of the conflict and try to give it a more constructive spin, but I'm not sure how close they will want to get to a real solution.
On that note, as we near the end of this very rich conversation, the sanctions that are targeting the regime for its human rights abuses and violations of and crimes against Syrian people are again being targeted in a campaign which basically presents the dire humanitarian situation in Syria as the reason to lift the sanctions. The European Union and Germany and the United States, especially since the adoption of the Caesar's Law, they were very much on course to keep these sanctions against the officials of the Syrian regime. Do you think that this could change in the near future?
Also here, we have a lot of people who never really looked into the sanctions and who are not aware that it's worth having a very differentiated discussion. For example, the European and the US sanctions are quite different in structure. European sanctions target individuals and entities of the Syrian regime involved in human rights violations, and they ban them from traveling into the EU, for example. They freeze their assets. These are not sectoral sanctions that make it impossible to deal with Syria or to trade with Syria. And I think these sanctions are absolutely right. They don't affect citizens. US sanctions, especially under the Caesar Act, are slightly different. They have an impact that might lead to especially a phenomenon called over-compliance, where companies or entities don't want to do business with companies in Syria because they fear they might be affected by these sanctions. However, there are clearinghouses to deal with exactly these questions. So whoever now is supporting this campaign about lifting the sanctions, why don't they ask for waivers? Why don't they ask for specific revisions? And why don't they wait for the Syrian regime to finally come up with a list of what exactly they lack to combat the humanitarian crisis that is developing? They have been asked time and again to provide a list of items that they claim are impossible to import and obtain under the Caesar Act and other sanctions. They have never responded to it. And if they provided lists, it was clear none of the goods they ever specified were sanctioned. So I would be very critical of the sanctions discourse. And I really hope that those who are deciding about keeping up the sanctions, lifting them, easing them, etc., really look into the sanctions themselves and try to understand their real impact, and don't just listen to this new wave of lift the sanctions, which is really undifferentiated and fails to understand the reasons for the suffering of the Syrian people. Mainly, in the end, it is still the regime through which goods go. Humanitarian access is absolutely restricted. There is just one border crossing any longer due to the Russian veto through which goods can come into Syria, if not through the regime. So the regime is controlling where humanitarian goods go. And this is what you need to consider if you look at why are people suffering, why are people starving. Also, you see probably always the ads that the new iPhone is available in Syria. It's also for always the newest technology. It is always available and always in the shops that are run by regime cronies. If it's possible to bring these goods, how can they tell me it's not possible to import wheat or to bring other humanitarian goods to Syria? So it's kind of a fake discussion, always launched by the Syrian regime, and politicians should carefully study what they vote for, what they opt for when it comes to sanctions. The majority of the sanctions is absolutely glass clear worth upholding.
I have one last question for you. You are a person, as I said, of great knowledge when it comes to Syria and Syrian context. And in this conversation, we have gone over some of the key issues of concern for the 13 million displaced Syrians who, in my eyes, are the key constituency to any future of the country. But let me ask you, how do you see the future of Syria? How do you see the future of the 13 million displaced in the circumstances that we described in this conversation? And what would be your message to them?
It's a difficult question. If you look at the devastation of Syria, if you see the terrible situation so many Syrians find themselves in, it looks like a very bleak future. And therefore, I would come back to the point that needs to change, and that is transition in Syria, because I'm absolutely thrilled and amazed by what I see people doing under these difficult circumstances in Syria, but also in the diaspora. There is so much of an engagement. And after all people went through, after all the hardship and after all the violence people experienced, there are still so many people who really organize and they do something on their own. And I think seeing the energy and the spirit in which people are doing this, we can believe in the Syrian people. If they have a chance, I think they will be able to rebuild and they will be able to build a better future. It's just that circumstances so far are not there.
Dr. Bente Scheller, the head of the Middle East section in the Heinrich Boell Foundation in Berlin, thank you very much for this conversation. You have, as we hoped, illuminated many of the key issues of concern for displaced Syrians, and I look forward to our next conversation, hopefully in the near future and hopefully in the more hopeful circumstances.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.